This episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast is sponsored in part by Law Enforcement Labor Services in Minnesota.
Law Enforcement Labor Services, also known as LELS, is Minnesota's largest public safety labor union, with over 7,000 Minnesota public safety members serving in all areas of public safety. Law enforcement, 911 dispatch centers, corrections, public safety administrative support personnel, and firefighters. Established in 1977, LELS serves over 260 different public safety agencies and over 450 locals across the state of Minnesota. With their administration, general counsel, 3 staff attorneys, and 14 business agents, LELS provides contract negotiations for better wages and benefits, grievance processing and representation, discipline representation, mediation and arbitration, assistance with representation for post-board hearings, and in-line of duty death benefits for survivor families. Find out more about law enforcement labor services at lels.org. lels.org.
Episodes of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast may contain strong language and violent content. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheriff Scott Rose from Minnesota, and I'm your host for today's new episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.
Walking eastbound.
In each episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast, we'll share the details and the stories of how these men and women heroically lost their lives in the line of duty. Our mission is to help ensure their service and sacrifice is never forgotten. Thanks for spending some time with me today to remember and honor these fallen heroes.
Just make your food up fresh
at Taco Bell, make you feel your taste buds tingle.
A 39-year-old restaurateur by the name of Glenn Bell started a new restaurant this year in Downey, California. His franchise would grow to over 8,000 restaurants, serving over 2 billion customers a year. He named it Taco Bell.
Taco Bell, 'cause we're the fast food place, Taco Bell.
It was completed this year in the Elysian Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, at a cost of $23 million, with seating for 56,000 fans. The facility was Dodger Stadium.
Welcome to Dodger Stadium before a crowd of approximately 56,000. The Dodgers loosening up on the field right now. Johnny Padres and Bob Perky. Here we go. The 1962 pennant race is underway at Dodger Stadium.
Dodger Stadium was the first major league ballpark to be built west of the Mississippi.
This is kind of an emotional thing for me because I've known about this show for a long time. And the newspapers and the magazines, and I've probably been interviewed 150 times in the last 9 months since I've known about this. As I say, you work up to it. We come over here this afternoon, we meet the guests that are on the show, and you get kind of charged up. I don't mean to be maudlin about it, but I know that tonight a lot of people, a lot of my friends are watching all over the country, and I only have one feeling as I stand here knowing that so many people are watching. I want my nana.
From New York, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson.
36-year-old Johnny Carson takes the stage as the Tonight Show's new host, replacing Jack Paar on this year, a position Johnny would hold for nearly 30 years.
Right now, let's welcome the fellow you waited 6 months to see.
The year was 1962. Central Minnesota is peppered with small towns that popped up in the late 1800s and early 1900s, mostly around rivers or railroads for transporting people initially, and then later primarily for transporting goods down to the Twin Cities and the Mississippi or up to Duluth to the Great Lakes. Meeker County is located approximately 1 hour west of Minneapolis and had a population of just under 20,000 people back in 1962. This small rural county consists of a combination of rolling farmlands and over 100 swimming and fishing lakes. Agriculture and recreation were key components of this conservative community. Lives focused around families, church, and school.
Everything was centered around the church and school activities. That was what everybody did. You worked and you had your church and your whatever you did at church and those activities in school. Sports activities were very, very, very important.
Darlene was 19 years old back in 1962. She was the daughter of veteran Meeker County Sheriff's Deputy Edward Eades. Friends and family referred to him as Ed. Back then, crime was low, and like many rural Midwestern counties, their small community set off and blew the civil defense sirens at night for curfew.
Crime was really low. There wasn't hardly anything. When the siren went off at night at 8 or 9 o'clock, then you were supposed to be home. All the kids were supposed to be home by then.
The Meeker County Sheriff's Office is located in Litchfield, which is a small community. Back then it was around 5,000 people. The sheriff at the time was Eldon Hardy, who had served as sheriff for Meeker County since 1949. Ed was one of his most experienced deputies.
He had a full-time job, and a part-time job. He liked bow and arrow hunting, so he was a bow and arrow enthusiast, and he liked guns. He made his own bullets, and he and a bunch of his, several of his law enforcement friends would go down in our cellar. It wasn't even a basement, it was a cellar with a dirt floor, and they would go down there and mix their gunpowder or whatever they were going to do, reloading, yeah. And so that was a fun thing for them to do. They shot the breeze and talked smart and loaded bullets. And my dad always said, if there was a fire, get out of the house right away because the thing's going to blow. So, don't take any chances if there's a fire. Just get out.
Ed was known as a hard worker. He worked full-time at the gate as a guard at the St. Cloud Reformatory, which is now referred to as the Minnesota State Prison or Minnesota Correctional Facility St. Cloud. Ed also served as a part-time deputy for Meeker County, and back then they referred to part-time deputies as special deputies. When Ed wasn't serving at the prison, he was on call for the sheriff's office. Ed's wife, Edith, was always very supportive of his dedication to the sheriff's office and to the community. In these stories, we often talk about the profession being a calling and how dedicated and selfless these men and women are who serve. What is often not talked about is the role of a law enforcement family, the role that they take on, the commitment and sacrifices they make for our communities and our safety every day. Back then, their special deputies were on call, and that call could come anytime, day or night, and his wife was always there to help.
She was always very supportive of him. One of the things that always surprised me was when he got the phone call, any phone call, if he had to go out, if there was an accident or somebody needed him for anything, she helped him get shoes or whatever he needed to get on. If it was the middle of the night, you helped him with the clothes. He was always out the door in 30 seconds. It was just mind-boggling. He couldn't get out fast enough. When they say sometimes we wait for police now for 30, 40 minutes or something, that was not the case with my dad. He was there in a heartbeat, always.
David was Darlene's older brother, and as the older brother, he got to do many ride-alongs with Ed and saw his dad in action. When Ed was working, the law was the law. That's what his kids would say. And Dave got to see that time and time again while he did ride-alongs with him.
Well, one of the things he did, one day he took me back into the jail, put me in a cell and locked the door and left. Then he came back 10, 15 minutes later. He says, now, it feels like you're locked up. I don't ever expect to see you in one of these again. Same thing when I got my driver's license. I was really happy in that. After supper, he leaned back and he says, now, I want you to know that if you ever have a moving violation, you won't see your license again until you're 21.
They said he was an old school cop that way. However, according to David, there was a soft side to Ed too, especially with animals.
He loved animals too. We always had a dog. We had a crow for a while. I'm not sure where he got that, but we had it. We were going on a trip. We gave it to my aunt, I believe it was, and she put it in the chicken coop. And the chickens killed it. Then we had a raccoon, a squirrel, and a skunk. Over at the reformatory, they were digging something out, and they found the skunk that killed the mother. And so it's the baby skunk. He brought it home. We fed it with an eyedropper, and when it got a little bit bigger, we had it deskunked, and it was a beautiful pet. It was pretty funny, too, because somebody walked in the door, and the skunk would kind of aim at him and pat its front feet, and they thought they were just afraid, but there was nothing there.
Back then, a lot of smaller agencies like the Meeker County Sheriff's Office didn't have marked squad cars. Their deputies would use their family cars as the squad cars when they were working. Ed's car was equipped with a siren, and it had portable red lights on the sun visor, so when he wanted a car to stop, he would put the visors down, showing the red lights. Other than the few tools he had on his belt, that was it. That was his squad. There were no cages. There was nothing fancy. It was the 2 red lights, a siren, and a radio. It was the early morning hours of Sunday, September 23rd, 1962. At approximately 1:18 a.m., a Meeker County Sheriff's dispatcher advised patrols that the Hagenson Pharmacy in Cosmos had been burglarized. Cosmos is one of those communities we talked about that was built around the railroad. And yes, it does have a space theme, including street names like Milky Way Street and Astro Boulevard. Other streets are named after planets. They have some named after constellations. And their annual city festival, you guessed it, is the Cosmos Space Festival. After dispatch advised patrols about the burglary, Meeker County Sheriff Eldon Hardy and Deputy Marvin Johnson headed out for the drugstore to investigate the break-in. Meanwhile, in Wilmer, which is a city of approximately 10,000 back then, located about 30 miles northwest of Cosmos, 31-year-old Officer Bill Van Ort was checking doors downtown. Van Ort was working the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift in Wilmer. Bill was a foot patrol officer. Now, back then, if you were assigned to foot patrol, your responsibility was to check doors, observe traffic, and observe the general condition of the town while walking. Bill had checked on a vehicle on 3rd Street by the Torvik Motor Company. He checked the doors there, and then he walked around to the back side of their building towards Vern's Tavern. While walking through the partial alleyway or cove between the two buildings, Bill walked towards the rear of Vern's bar. He was going to check the door, pull on the door to make sure it was locked, when he saw a flash of light. He felt something hit his right side, and then he went down. Bill had just been shot in the ribs, and he never saw the shooter. 2 workers at the nearby Great Northern Train Depot, who were on their lunch break sitting in one of the engines on the track, said they saw a person at the doorway trying to get the door open at Vern's Tavern. They said they watched him walk around the building and then a short time later run to the parking lot, jump into a car, and drive away with the headlights off, heading east on Highway 12. They explained that they were sitting in a train engine when it was idling, so they didn't hear anything. They just saw what was happening. They would call the police and report the suspicious man in the vehicle, indicating they thought the car was a green 1959 Chevy. Back then, they called dispatchers police aides, and the police aide working that night for Wilmer was John Anderson. He received a call from the railroad at 3:20 a.m. He sent car number 2, driven by Officer Sanford Larson, who was working the 11 to 7 shift that night, to check on Vern's Tavern. Larson checked the front door, and then he walked around through the alley to check the rear door, and that's where he found Bill laying in the roadway. It was 3:25 a.m. Officer Larson called out on the radio that he found Bill shot and down behind the tavern. Bill was laying in a prone position in the roadway in the alley between the 2 buildings. He was conscious, so Officer Larson pulled back his coat, and he could see that he'd been shot in the side. He was able to get Bill into his squad, and then he took him to Rice Memorial Hospital, which was 2 blocks from the tavern. The bullet was initially left alone, doctors thinking there would be no harm in leaving the bullet where it was, but it would eventually be removed on the 19th of November after Van Ort had complications. It was removed from the central part of his back near his spine. The Wilmer Police Dispatcher then sent this information via radio to St. Paul Highway Patrol to tell them to be on the lookout for the vehicle reported by the radio staff, a 1959 green Chevy. Meeker County Dispatch heard the broadcast and then they relayed it to Sheriff Hardy and Deputy Johnson, who were on their way to Cosmos. He told them there was a burglary in Wilmer, and Officer Van Ort had been shot and injured. He indicated little information was available other than the suspect fled eastward out of Wilmer in a green 1959 Chevy. Sheriff Hardy immediately alerted Deputy Ed Eades. Ed's son, David, who often rode with Ed on calls, was back from the military, but he was asleep upstairs when this call came in.
I didn't hear the call. My bedroom was upstairs. And so they answered it. Dad says, go wake up David, so you ride with me. And my mother said, well, it's late. Let him sleep. So I missed out. I was a little disappointed. So he got a hold of the town constable, Ole Nisler, to ride with him.
Ole Nisler was Eden Valley's night watchman. Ed and Ole responded to the intersection of Highway 22 and 55 in Eden Valley, watching for the suspect vehicle, reported as a dark-colored Chevy. A few minutes later, 30 to 45 minutes after the Wilmer officer was shot, Ed observed a black, late 50s Pontiac slowly drive through the intersection. Even though it wasn't green like reported, it was a GMC, it was a Pontiac, and it appeared to be the right year, so Ed followed the car out of town and activated his lights to pull it over. The Pontiac pulled over on the side of the road, 2 blocks east of intersection 22 and 55. Ed pulled up behind it and stopped. Ed stepped out of his squad, armed with a double-barrel shotgun. Pointing the gun at the ground, Ed said, "Get out of your car, please. Get out of your car with your hands up. With your hands up." The driver opened the door, began to get out of the car. Ed noticed the driver holding his right hand against his chest. Suddenly, the man yelled, "Here I am, you put your hands up," and fired 6 to 7 rounds at Ed. At this time, they were only 20 feet apart. The first shot missed Ed. The second tore into Ed's face near his mouth, and the third ripped into his left hand. Ed, stunned by the shots, let loose a blast from his double-barrel shotgun, striking the suspect, later identified as Rudolph K. Ellis, in the right arm. Ellis then ran around the front of Ed's car and attacked Ole Nisler, who had just gotten out of the car. Ellis fired 1 round at Nisler, striking the tip of his fingernail. Ed pulled his handgun and later explained, "I thought he was going to kill Ole for sure. I was firing at Ellis with my pistol. I think I hit him once as he circled in the front of the car in the glare of the headlights." The investigation would later show that Ed's first shot struck Ellis in the jacket, going through the jacket sleeve but not striking Ellis's arm. Ellis sprung at Ed's partner Ole and knocked him down to the ground. Ellis then managed to get back into his car and he sped off. Ed, injured and bleeding from 2 bullet wounds, fired at the fleeing Pontiac and struck it twice. He then wrote down the license number and decided due to his injuries he wasn't going to chase it. Ed got on the radio and explained they had just gotten into a shooting with the suspect and that he had fled in a black Pontiac and gave out the license plate number. Remember, officers originally thought they were looking for a green Chevy. This information from Ed would be key in finding Ellis and later convicting him. Ed suggested that Dassel police immediately head toward 15 from Dassel to try and intercept the suspect at Kimball. With 2 gunshot wounds, 1 to the face and 1 to the hand, Ed now drove himself to the Meeker Memorial Hospital for treatment. The hunt for the suspect seemed to go cold until just before 6 a.m. when police in St. Cloud, about 30 minutes northeast of where the shooting took place, spotted the black Pontiac driving into town from the south on Highway 152. Officers reported they were in pursuit. They pursued the vehicle. It was traveling between 80 and 100 miles per hour towards Waite Park. A few minutes later during the pursuit, the suspect ran into the rear end of another car, driven by Elmer Carlson. His wife was in the passenger seat. The officers got out of their squads and ordered the suspect out of the black Pontiac. Ellis opened the driver's door, stepped out of the car, and with his hands in his pockets, started running towards the officers. One officer shot at Ellis with his shotgun, striking his feet. Ellis continued towards the officers and was shot a second time in the left shoulder by another officer. Ellis, now kneeling, was handcuffed, arrested, and transported to St. Cloud Hospital for treatment. Ellis told the officers that he had gotten rid of the gun and that the gun would never be found. On the website, there is an actual photograph of the moment these officers took Ellis into custody. Elmer Carlson, the man who was driving the car that was struck by Ellis, and his wife suffered injuries in the crash but were listed in good condition in St. Cloud Hospital on Monday. Officials suspected Ellis started the night with the burglary in Cosmos. They believed he stopped at some point after shooting Ed to get rid of the gun, or it was tossed out of the window during the pursuit. Now remember, there were no ballistics back then, but the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. were able to compare the bullets from Van Ort and Ed and testified that the round came from the same gun, a .22 caliber handgun. Ed's family was now notified of the shooting.
I never even heard the phone call that my mom got that he was shot. I was sleeping soundly at that point. And she came upstairs because we were sleeping upstairs and said that there'd been an accident. He'd been shot.
The sheriff called and said that he was over in the hospital over in Litchfield, and so we raced over there quick. And like I said, in total shock. He had to when the car came through town, he followed it out to the edge of town, so he wasn't in town when it happened. And then he had to drive back into town and right past our house to get to Litchfield. And total shock walking in because one side of his face was, it looked like bumps on one side. The cheek and the face was all, it had bandages on it, of course. It went in the corner of his mouth, back around the side of his face, and they cut the bullet out back in his neck, on the side of his neck.
Ed was in the hospital, being treated for gunshot wounds to his face and his left hand from the gun battle with Ellis. Miraculously, Ed's injuries, including the one to the face, weren't life-threatening. And he was spry and chipper in the hospital when he was questioned by the media about the shooting. His face badly swollen and his hand heavily bandaged. He was asked, "How does it feel to be shot in the face from 20 feet away by a wild, fear-crazed fugitive?" "It's not fun," replied Ed, "and if there's a next time, I hope I get in the first shot." He told David later that his biggest regret was not taking Ellis out.
The one regret he had was that he was a very good pistol shot, on the range, where you do the range shooting, but not combat shooting. He never practiced that. When he got out of the hospital and got home, he practiced drawing and doing it combat style. He was, like I said, really disappointed that he didn't drop the guy right there.
Soon after his release from the hospital, Ed was given an honorary Purple Heart from the sheriff's office for his heroic efforts.
The sheriff's department, they made him a Purple Heart for the Battle of Eden Valley.
Now, there's a picture on the website of the heart. The Purple Heart was a large, stuffed heart with a ribbon that indicated it was for the Battle of Eden Valley, the city where the shooting took place. His fellow deputies and the sheriff, they had fun with it. Honestly, everyone was just really happy that with all the shooting that night, with all 3 shooting incidents with Ellis, they were happy that nobody got killed. This case would take a tragic turn just 15 days later. It was 2 weeks and a day since Ed had been shot. He was ready to get back to work. It was one day after his 55th birthday. Ed got into his vehicle and he drove towards St. Cloud en route to his job at the reformatory. On the way, Ed suffered a massive heart attack. His vehicle left the roadway on Highway 15 and stopped in a clump of bushes about 4 miles south of St. Cloud. Ed was found there in his car. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything they could do to help. Deputy Edward Eades was dead. An autopsy conducted by Dr. J.P. McDowell, who was the Stearns County coroner, indicated Ed died as a result of a blood clot found in a heart muscle. While it's easy for one to assume that a blood clot was likely the result of his being shot 15 days earlier, Dr. McDowell indicated he could not be 100% certain that Ed's death, Ed's heart attack, was a direct result of being shot by Ellis. At the time, Ellis was still in St. Cloud Hospital recovering from his gunshot wounds from being apprehended in St. Cloud. Ellis had originally been charged with assault with a deadly weapon in the wounding of Ed and Wilmer officer Bill Van Ort. Meeker County Attorney Leland Olson said the charges would not be changed as a result of Ed's death, citing that the pathologist report didn't positively determine that Ed's injuries suffered in the shooting attributed to his death. Therefore, Olson felt there was no basis for calling a grand jury to investigate. Ellis would be then transferred to the Meeker County Hospital and kept under 24-hour guard while he recovered. Ed's funeral was held on Thursday, October 11th in their small family church, the Eden Valley Church of God in Litchfield. He was buried in Eden Lake Cemetery. Ellis pled not guilty to an assault with a deadly weapon charge in district court. Trial was tentatively set for January 21st by Judge Roloff. However, the judge said the trial will be set back to the spring if John Cochran, who was Ellis's attorney, could prove through doctors' affidavits that his client was not physically able to stand trial on January 21st. At the arraignment, Cochran contended that Ellis was suffering severe physical impairment, and this prevented him from conferring with his client enough to prepare his case. Ellis appeared before Judge Roloff after the issuance of a bench warrant for his arrest issued by the judge when Ellis failed to appear for the arraignment on Tuesday. County Attorney Leland Olson reported at the arraignment that the state was ready to try the case at any date set by the judge. He also moved for a forfeiture of the $5,000 bond posted by Ellis. Olson contended that the bond should be forfeited because Ellis failed to appear on Tuesday. Judge Roloff denied the motion for this bond forfeiture. One of the key pieces of evidence that prosecutors plan to use to tie Ellis to the crimes committed that evening was a notebook Ed kept in his vehicle, a notebook that disappeared before the trial.
He had a little console on the seat of the car where he wrote down the license plate in the car and that, and there was blood on that from writing on it and that, and somehow that disappeared. And we had in the garage, and of course, in East Valley, the garage wasn't locked, and that disappeared. And that was one of the things that came up in the court case. How do you know it was that car? Well, it was on this thing, and well, where is it? No idea.
The notebook was never found. Did someone take it simply as a souvenir, or did someone take it to help the defense? Nobody really knows. What they did know was Ed was a great cop. He took notes. He always paid attention to the details, and writing down that plate number and giving it out to the other officers on duty is what eventually led to Ellis getting stopped in St. Cloud and arrested. Ed's actions certainly saved lives that night. Actions that would, in the end, cost him his own. After 2 weeks of heated testimony, the jury of 8 men and 5 women found Ellis guilty of first-degree assault of the 2 officers. Attorneys moved for immediate sentencing and asked the judge to consider his prior conviction for third-degree burglary, which could be used to enhance the length of the sentence. Ellis was questioned and admitted that he had been convicted of burglary back in 1942. Judge Ganrud spoke, "Mr. Ellis, are you able to stand?" Ellis leaned heavily on his cane, got to his feet slowly, and Judge Ganrud pronounced sentence. "This court hereby sentences you to hard labor at the state prison until discharged in due course of law by competent authority." The sentence was for an indeterminate number of years, not to exceed 20 years. Maximum sentence for conviction on an assault with a deadly weapon charge was 10 years, but a previous conviction permits the sentence to be doubled. Judge Ganrud set bail at $10,000, and Ellis was turned over to the custody of the Meeker County Sheriff's Office. Ed's family was relieved that the trial was over. The verdict was bittersweet. They certainly would have liked to have seen a higher charge against Ellis, but they were satisfied that he was going to go to prison for his actions. They knew nothing in that courtroom could bring Ed back. Ellis's attorney informed the judge of their intent to appeal the ruling, indicating they would be presenting an alibi for Ellis. That alibi would never be heard. 2 years after the trial, in November of 1965, St. Paul Attorney John Cochran and Meeker County Attorney Leland Olson were scheduled to appear before the judge to argue Cochran's request for a new trial for Rudolph Ellis. That was until Ellis was found hanging from his cell door in his cell at the Stillwater State Prison on Friday night, November 5th. Ed Eades died a day after his 55th birthday. He served his country in World War II, and he was a member of the Disabled American Veterans Chapter of St. Cloud, a member of the Civil Defense Unit, the West Central Peace and Police Officers Association, and the National Sheriff's Association. Ed had served in law enforcement for 17 years and had served 12 of those years as a deputy for Meeker County. Ed's entire adult life was spent serving his country, his state, and his community. His wife and kids all made sacrifices so Ed could proudly serve. Sacrifices to help keep their community safe. And in the end, Ed made the ultimate sacrifice and lost his life. As you can imagine, the loss of this hero was devastating to this family, but they had to continue on. That's what Ed would have wanted. David, now out of the military, would get his teaching degree and serve as a 6th grade teacher. Education was important to Ed, and he insisted Dave get a college education. Darlene would also follow suit and get her teaching degree as well. A family dedicated to service, a testament to the example set by their parents, Ed and Edith. Edith stayed busy. She continued to work, but she would never marry or date again. Edith passed away in 2000, 38 years after Ed's death, at the age of 86. In 1991, Ed Eades was recognized at the National Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C., just shy of 30 years from the day he died. 21 years later, in 2012, the Meeker County Sheriff's Office dedicated a memorial plaque to the memory of Ed in honor for his service and sacrifice to the county. A photo from this event is on Ed's page with his family. Ed left behind his beautiful wife Edith, his children David and Darlene, and his grandson Michael. He would never get to meet his grandkids, Alexandra, Christina, Nicholas, and Sherry. Stories like Ed's remind us of the importance of law enforcement in our communities, the importance and need for good men and women to take on this honorable calling. Good, honest, hardworking people. Now, these people are our local heroes. They are heroes that care, heroes that believe in service before self, heroes like Ed. This story reminds us of the risks these men and women take on every day. They walk out the door in uniform and say goodbye to their families, all knowing that they may not return home. Risks they're willing to take to protect most they don't even know. And for those that don't return home, like Ed, his story reminds us that we must always remember and support our survivor families because their sacrifice is eternal, which is why we must always work to ensure that their service and sacrifice is never forgotten.
Walking eastbound.
Thank you for spending the time to listen, learn about, and honor the memory of this fallen hero. Make sure you take the time to thank your local law enforcement for their service and their sacrifice. And don't forget to thank their families too. They also sacrifice so much for our safety. It's up to us to help ensure the sacrifices made by these fallen heroes and by their families are never forgotten. So please share this podcast with family and friends. Until next time, this is the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. I'm Scott Rose. Thanks for listening.